our ongoing interview series, I want to introduce you to Holy Cross alum Kyle Irvine, class of 21, who is a senior associate consultant at Hayden Consulting in Boston. Kyle is going to discuss the case study interview. Thanks for being here, Kyle. I'm so excited to have this recorded conversation with you. Can you start by briefly telling us about your career journey since graduating from Holy Cross?
Sure. Thanks, Pam. Happy to be here this morning. So as Pam mentioned, I'm a senior associate consultant at Hayden Consulting Group in Boston. I have been there for just shy of 2 years now, since I graduated from Holy Cross in May of 2021. And I've been in my current role as a senior associate for about 8 months now. And Hayden is a small boutique consulting firm in the life sciences, specifically focused in the practice areas of market access and commercialization strategy for pharma.
Excellent. I appreciate that intro, Kyle. Without further ado, I'm going to dive right into my questions. So, can you tell us what exactly is a case study interview?
Sure. So I think at the simplest level, what a case study interview really is a hypothetical situation or a business question that's going to be posed to you by an interviewer. And your key task is going to be to walk the interviewer through your structured thinking on how you would go about answering and then ultimately delivering whatever that answer is. And I would say there are two main types of case interview questions in my experience. The first is going to be what we call a market sizing question, where the interviewer will ask you something that seems very random, like how many cups of coffee do you think are sold in Boston each day? Or a really famous example is how many windows do you think there are in Germany? And you're going to be tasked with walking the interviewer through how you would go about answering that. And then the second is a more quote unquote formal full case, which you're going to be given a hypothetical business question to break down and take the interviewer through from start to finish on something like a hypothetical client launching into a new market, understanding a product's profitability, things like that.
Awesome. Great. So you've kind of touched on it a little bit, but can you go into some more detail about then how a case study interview would be structured, maybe components of the interview?
Sure. I would say there are three main sections of a case interview as I think about it. The first at the beginning is going to be the delivery and structuring of the prompt. And this is where, when you kick off the case interview portion of a case interview after 3 to 4 minutes of the traditional, tell me about yourself, why you're interested, this is where the interviewer is going to give you the case interview prompt. And you're going to take a minute or two to digest, paraphrase the question or problem back to the interviewer, ask any clarifying questions, and start to detail the high-level process or approach that you're going to take to answering the question. That second part of the interview is going to be, I would say, the majority of the case interview, and that's going to be all about the structure. So this is where you're going to walk the interviewer through that process you just outlined to answer the question and start to work towards an answer to the question. And this is where you're going to be detailing each step of the way to the interviewer. So for example, now I'm doing this because I assume that. And this is also where you're going to be asking for any relevant information or data from the interviewer that oftentimes they have and they're ready to give you, but they won't give it to you if you don't ask for it. So it's important to, as you're walking through, you say, I'm doing this because I'm assuming that. And that's an area where you can say, do you have any assumptions around, for example, the market size or the target demographic that they'll give you if you ask for?
Terrific.
And then that final part of the case interview is going to be that recommendation. And this is where you're going to deliver your ultimate answer if it's a market sizing question, or that ultimate recommendation if it's one of those quote unquote full cases of, yes, I think client X should launch product Y into this market because A, B, and C, or no, and noting any caveats and or areas that you would explore further, if this was a real consulting project for a real client.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that breakdown. I just want to ask a little bit more about those clarifying questions because typically in an interview, you don't necessarily ask questions kind of as the interview is going on, right? But it sounds like what you're saying to me is it's important for you to ask those clarifying questions, and you're going to learn more that's needed to help you answer the question correctly, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially in one of those full cases where they might be asking you a question about a random market that you know nothing about, whether that's you're interviewing for a specialized firm and they're asking you a healthcare specific question, or they're asking you a question about a liquor distributor, and you just don't know that. The worst thing that they can say to you is we don't have any information on that, but they will still appreciate the question because it shows, at the end of the day, it shows that you're thinking about it in a structured way and that you're willing to collaborate with someone else on a team, which more on that later, I think.
Excellent. Good. Great. Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about what industries typically utilize the case study interview?
I would say, in my experience, management consulting is definitely the biggest industry that uses case study interviews, but across a bunch of different functions within finance, they're used as well because they're meant to test and do a few different things that are super important to management consulting, but they're also important to a bunch of different jobs and careers as well. The first, as I just touched on, is all about collaboration. How does this interviewee collaborate, which is super important in consulting because you're always going to be working on a team, whether that's a big team of a bunch of people at your level overseen by senior staff, or whether that's just you working with senior staff. You're always going to be working on a team and you're always going to be collaborating. The second big thing there is problem solving and pivoting your thinking. Especially in consulting, you're always going to have to pivot your thinking on the fly as you're in client meetings and you get a piece of information that the client feels like is a throwaway, but it absolutely changes your recommendation. It absolutely changes your model. And you need to be able to demonstrate that you can pivot that thinking on the fly. The third, which I think is the biggest component of the case interview, is all about structure. Can the interviewee structure not only their thinking, but also their communication? And I would say the communication is the most important part, where as soon as you start your career, you're going to be delivering recommendations, key insights from analyses to senior staff and ultimately clients. And you want to have that clear and concise structured communication so you can really get the so what across. And then I would say my final point in what case studies are supposed to do, which I think is my personal favorite, and I think frankly gets overlooked more often than not, especially when people talk about case interviews. So I'm going to give it its moment of fame, is all about coachability. And is this interviewee coachable? And can they receive feedback? Because sometimes in a case study interview, and why it's important to walk the interviewer through your structure, is they might say, are you sure about that? Or did you think about this? Or I'm not sure that's necessarily right. Can we think about that a different way? And what that's meant to do is test, can you take feedback? More important than just pivoting that thinking on the fly, it's, are you just going to say, oh, no, that's great, but I still think I'm right, which you should not do because you're always going to be receiving feedback in any job, any career that you pursue. And I think about it as taking it as an opportunity to learn from someone who knows more than you And it's super important in a case interview because that's often indicative of the type of employee that you might be if you work in consulting at this company. And that's generally not the type of entry level consultant that people are looking for.
Great, thank you. Awesome. You have done a little bit of this, but I'm going to ask you just to go a little bit further. Can you talk a little bit more about what are some possible interview questions that you might get? And again, you've stated some already.
Yeah, so there are a couple of different classic ones. So some that I mentioned for those market sizing questions of how many cups of coffee do you think are sold in Boston each day? How many windows are there in Germany? How many alcoholic beverages do you think get sold at Gillette Stadium? Just classic, making sure you can make reasonable assumptions and do some mental math and get to an answer that you feel confident about. With respect to those full cases, more formal cases, there are a bunch of different questions. So one that I really like is, should your client, who is a liquor manufacturer, enter into the bottled water market? And if so, how should they brand the product and what types of retail distribution should they pursue? I think there's a lot of stuff to think about there, and it makes for a really great conversation because a lot of people who are interviewing think it's awkward to talk about liquor in an interview. So it's always funny too. And in addition to these more classic standard questions, firms in specialized practice areas like the life sciences, healthcare, government, education, just to name a few out of the probably 100 there are out there, they may also give cases specific to those industries. So, for example, in the life sciences, where I am, a sample case question might be, should your client launch a new product, a new pharmaceutical product into this market, given that there are a couple of different treatment options here? And for these, I think people who are interviewing always get a little rattled because they say, oh, I don't know anything about pharma, or I don't know anything about education and I want to learn and that's why I want this job. And so what I would recommend there is just doing a little bit of research on, if you're interviewing at a company, you should be doing this anyways, but go on their website. Oftentimes consulting companies will have an overview of who we are and what we do and some sample types of project work that they offer. And that's a great first resource to see what kinds of questions they might ask. And in these types of cases, these are where those clarifying questions that we talked about earlier are even more important because they don't expect you to be an expert in whatever market you might be talking about, whether that's in pharma, that's in education, or that's in a niche area of government affairs. But that's another area you can demonstrate that you're coachable and you can take the feedback and that you're really interested in learning more about, at the end of the day, the work that that company does.
Excellent. Good advice there. So again, nice segue to my next question. Maybe talk about some other ways that students can be successful in a case study. What other things that can they do to prepare other than that research that you talked about?
Yeah, the biggest way to prepare in my mind is just to practice. And there are a couple of different ways to go about this. You can practice with a peer. This is especially great during, the fall recruiting season where everyone's interviewing. And if you have a friend or two who are practicing, you can go back and forth. And there are also a bunch of different resources. There are a couple of different great books that have a bunch of examples of case interviews and will really walk you through the process. The classic there being a book called Case in Point, which you will hear from, I'm sure, everyone in the career development office and any consulting recruiter that you talk to. But there are also a bunch of videos where people will go through a practice case step by step and detail the steps. And there are a lot of great virtual repositories of practice cases through like Harvard Business School has a bunch, and a lot of the big consulting firms have repositories on their website. And those are not necessarily cases that you'll see, but they're very similar. And sort of once you get a flavor for the types of different questions that they ask in those cases, you're pretty prepared. So practice beforehand is really important. but it's also important to keep a couple of things in mind when you're going through the interview itself. And the biggest one there is to go slow, which is easier said than done as someone who has done quite a fair share of case study interviews. But don't feel like you need to rush through any math or any thinking, and really embrace any awkward feeling silence while you may be thinking. It's not awkward, and your interviewer will appreciate your ability to pause and think, because at the end of the day, that's going to allow you to have a more structured answer, which is so important. And if you can demonstrate that, especially when the stakes are higher in an interviewer and in an interview, and you know your interviewer knows that you're nervous, and if you can just embrace that, you'll have a better case study experience and ultimately be able to demonstrate not only a better recommendation, but also a better process and methodology to your thinking.
Awesome. And should you be writing things down as you're doing your case? I mean, I feel like there's a lot of figures and stuff happening.
Yeah, absolutely. You always want to be taking notes, even when you're getting the prompt, and you want to be taking notes on, oh, it's this market, and here's what they're saying about the client. And then anytime that you're given any numbers of, your addressable patient population is X, you're not going to remember it. Write it down, do the math on the paper. When they say, mental math, it's not, oh, I have to do this division, this subtraction in my head. It's just you're not using a calculator. And at the end of the day, the notes is also a big thing where you can show your interviewer that you're an active listener and that you can recall this later, because when you're on a consulting project, your senior staff's not taking notes. You're taking notes and they're asking you for the notes. So it's a great habit to get into right off the bat. Yeah, great question.
Good. And are they looking for the correct, the right, a specific answer?
No, something that is reasonable and defendable. And I think that more around the market sizing questions, where they're not going to ding you if you say that the population of the United States is 300 million when it's really something like 350 million, because that's going to make your math easier. But if they say, how many alcoholic drinks do you think are sold in Gillette Stadium? And you say, well, because I know that there's 5 seats in Gillette Stadium, like that is just not reasonable. And then with respect to the full cases, it's all about that defendability piece. Like, you don't just want to say, I think this client should launch into this market, or I don't think this client should launch into this market, period, because what did you just spend the last 10 minutes thinking about? Or however long, you spent going through it. You
Right.
always want to say, well, I don't think this client should launch into this market because, it's saturated. They don't have an undifferentiated product profile, and the profitability is not there. And the answer might be, well, maybe they should launch because of these 3 other things that you didn't think about. But as long as you're detailing that there's a quote unquote method to your madness, you don't need the right answer, because there is no right answer oftentimes. It can go either way. And as you learn and you do more cases, you could, have a quote unquote textbook perfect case interview where you give opposite recommendations, and it's all about the process and the structure and the defendability of your recommendation.
Great, great. One other question that I'm just going to throw at you based on what you've said. Are there some figures, mathematical numbers that you should know going in, like how many people are in the world?
Yes. And one of the reasons why I love the book Case in Point so much is because one of the chapters is all about this. Albeit I'm sure my edition is a little outdated at this point, but things like the population of the US, things like how many, like what the age distribution is, which is a really interesting one. Typically, you can just assume like 10% in each like decile of ages. So, 10%, 20 to 29, 10%, 30 to 39, etc. Um, and I would say those are probably the biggest ones, and any other ones are just like a reasonable assumption. So if you're asked, how many cups of coffee do you think get sold in Boston? You don't have to know the population of Boston, but if you say 500 people, unreasonable. If you say 100 million people, also probably unreasonable. So as long as you're saying, as you're walking the interviewer through your process, well, I'm going to assume that there are, 500,000 people who commute into Boston for an office job every day. And your interviewer knows that. So you're not just doing math on a piece of paper for 5 minutes. And then you say, I think there are however many cups of coffee sold a day. Cause then they say, how did you get there? Right.
Yeah.
Um, so a couple numbers that you should know, and most numbers that you should just be able to have a reasonably defendable range for, that at the end of the day, selfishly will also make your math easier.
Great, good, excellent. Thank you so much. Um, two more questions. Can you talk a little bit about some entry-level roles that a Holy Cross student could expect would be, available to them upon graduation?
Across most consulting firms, including the big four and smaller firms, there are a host of entry-level roles, and typically each consulting firm has a type of entry-level role, except for maybe a super small one, which you probably honestly wouldn't come across on Handshake or LinkedIn anyways. But I see two main types of entry-level roles in consulting. The first are going to be job postings with titles like analyst or associate. And these positions are generally not client facing, and they're more research focused roles for client facing folks. And you become client facing as you become more senior. So typically you'll go from like analyst to associate consultant, etc. And then once you hit that associate consultant title, that's when you'll start having more interactions with clients. The other main type of entry level title is where you start at a title like associate consultant. And this is where the expectation is that you'll be client facing early on in your career at the entry level. Certainly, not on your first day, but you don't have to hit any arbitrary, time period or title change to get there. And this is what Hayden's entry level position is that I started in. And it was a really great experience to have that client facing aspect early on. It's something that I ended up liking more than I thought I would about consulting. And it was really awesome to be presenting to senior level clients on my first project, as opposed to, spending 18 months, doing research, building deliverables just to have someone else present them. But across pretty much every consulting firm, there is some type of entry level position, and it's really more about the type of work that you want to do. If you want to go into big four general management consulting, or if you want to go into a smaller, more specialized practice area like where we are in the life sciences, and what your appetite is for research versus client time.
Great. And I guess my final question to you is there anything I forgot to ask you that you think is important to share?
I think the only thing is thinking about case interviews within the overall context of the full interview process for consulting. I would say there's generally going to be 2 to 3 case interviews in your full interview process. And usually the first 1 or 2 is going to be one of those market sizing questions. And then that final one will be one of those full formal cases. And those are typically paired with 2 to 3 of those behavioral fit type interviews. We always say it's a lot of interviews, but hopefully it pays off in a job offer. And it is really important to just be able to assess who you are as a person in those behavioral fit interviews, and how you can structure your thinking, take feedback, be coachable. all those things we talked about earlier in consulting, because it's just such a team dynamic throughout your project work and throughout your career. No matter how senior you get, you're always going to be on a team. Just depends, where on the team you are. So it's really important to make sure that, you're dedicated in the process and you're excited about the work, just as we are excited about the prospect of having you join us.
Great. That's great advice. This has been great, Kyle. I really appreciate your insight, your examples, just the thoroughness in how you responded to these questions. I know it will be super helpful for Holy Cross students as they're preparing for a case study. So thank you so much for your time, and it's been great to spend this last half hour with you. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pam.